Welcome. This is the First Amendment, historically speaking, and my name is Frederick Douglass Dixon, and I will be your host today. I want to, again, thank UPTV for allowing us to come and forward what we consider to be valuable information, mandated information, and the ability to reach out and touch those in our local viewing audience. Today is a show that we want to discuss the idea of education and the weight that it has. Education in itself is a stalwart of American society, and for the most part, education is an avenue that lots of people use as a springboard into a higher demographic, both mentally, aesthetically, as well as materially. So when we begin to think about education, education has played a huge portion in American society and continues to play a huge portion in American society, and something that we should look to and wonder about the avenues that education will indeed take in the near future. So if that is the case, what education will take in the near future, then I think that we would be proper to start and find out the role that education has played in the very past. So education in itself has allowed the thought of people being educated and those who will forward education. And we'll look at both of those crowds, those who will be educated, those who have been educated, and those who have forwarded the information. But before we do, I would like to make it very plain, and this is something that's very vital, that we come up with a functional definition of what education is. And we can use Mr. Webster's dictionary, and we'll begin by saying education is the act or the process of imparting or acquiring knowledge, developing the powers of reasoning and judgment, and generally preparing oneself and others intellectually for a mature life. Another definition, the act or process of imparting or acquiring a particular knowledge, skill set as for a profession. One more, a degree, level, or kind of schooling. The result produced by instruction, training, or study, the science and the art of teaching. Now, when we talk about science, science is indeed a part of what we know to be formal education, but science means, or it comes from, the word seal, which means to know. So when we know about education, we firmly believe that education in itself should be infinite. What we mean by that is continued education. Those things that don't stop when you're in the classroom, that don't stop when you close a certain book, that don't stop, but it encourages the mind to continue to look and be very critical about what it is that we look to. So education in itself is a paradigm that should be infinite. Well, a lot of the times what we know to be education has tied into more of what we call training. Training in itself is to get to have a person, a group, or individuals to be able to efficiently pull off a task, to be able to as quickly and with the least amount of what we call resistance to learn to be able to produce, learn to be able to forward, learn to be able to assimilate. Education and assimilation in America. To assimilate is to be absorbed fully, this is a functional definition, by the host society. What we mean by being absorbed fully by the host society, it would take every walk of life. So someone who is absorbed by American society, Western education, would look to education as perhaps a means to create an avenue that one prior never saw or was not able to take part in. So when we talk about education versus training, and if you guys have been with us over the last 4 weeks, then we talk about the idea of black studies versus the study of blacks. We'll continue to go back to that paradigm and how education fits into that. Well, more specifically, when we talk about education and we talk about the educators, a very wise man once said, this is Dr. Lerone Bennett, out of Chicago right now, originally one who has trotted the world, has globe-trotted. But he makes a very serious and forwards us a very serious thought when he says, in a system of oppression, an educator is either a revolutionary or an oppressor. So there is no in between. And I want to repeat that and go very slowly. He said, in a system of oppression, an educator is either a revolutionary or an oppressor. So when we understand clearly what education is set up for here in America, and here we go. When education is set up for here in America, in contrast to education and what it could be being infinite, education in America is in itself, it is definitely what we call has barriers, and it produces those who can, number one, obey laws, and then those two who will be very, very compliant in the idea of what they learned and whom they learned it for. So we go back to the educator. But with more seriousness, we go back to what the educator does in the classroom, or what those who have set up what we know as an educational system have left as vestiges. So when we talk about the idea of what happens in a classroom, and this is being very specific here, we're talking about curriculum, instruction, and those who will forward with that particular thought. So the American education system has a dual purpose for educating blacks and black children in specific. The idea of socialization, the idea of the socialization into, or being absorbed by the socialization into Western education, or the thought of Western education, in accepting a system, a historical backdrop that has a culture that is drowned, steeped, and rooted in Anglo-American culture. So, a very wise man once said, and this is Dr. Bobby E. Wright. Dr. Bobby Wright is the very first black graduate from the University of Chicago with a PhD in psychology. And he explains to us that when one looks to education, then we are looking to tie into a group that perhaps has more power than you currently do. So education and power tie in hand. So the second part of education is for economic productivity for the elites. So the masses can look to this in a Marxist thought when we have the proletariats and the bourgeoisies. So more specifically, education can be the tool that liberates. And when we understand that education civilizes us, then we have to look to, again, what Bobby Wright has said. And he begins to tell us that when you use education, you have to use what has already gone before you, or master what the experts have mastered to become a master. So when we talk about education, Bobby Wright says again that the idea of using Western world definitions to explain black phenomena is a mistake. We can never use Western world's definition of what is important in education to explain black phenomena. So the education has to be one that elucidates or forwards the light of understanding under the searchlight of truth, and allows us to be critical thinkers about paradigms. So education in itself, when it allows you to research your researcher and find out what they researched and why they researched it, more specifically, who profits from that research, then we're beginning to have an education that's what we call infinite. So when we understand that what education has for us in America, more specifically the blacks that it trains, it has to be able to raise the consciousness. Well, the idea of raising consciousness and becoming critical thinkers about education would indeed have you challenging the system of education, which is very questionable if that's the desired outcome. So when it raises the conscious, it will ask questions and tell us who we are, which has been defined by Western education. Who the enemy is, which has been hidden by Western education. What it does and what it's doing to us and what it will do to us in the future, which is hidden. When for us to understand how to pull the best out of education and leave the rest out of what we call education. So education must, in its infinite role, must allow us to be critical about the curriculum. It must allow us to be critical about those who are forwarding and for what reasons. So Dr. Carter G. Woodson talked about a miseducation. The miseducation of the Negro, which is indeed a classic work. And he talks about it from the very beginning in chapter 1. He talks about the educated Negro has developed a contempt for his own people through the education that he's been forwarded by the Western world. So education becomes very complex. Education becomes an avenue for confusion. Education becomes an avenue for you to look to your oppressor as one who will forward information that can somehow enlighten you, when we have to question that. Now, we need to go very quickly to Brother Malcolm X and what he said. Now, what Malcolm X said about education, and he said it very poignantly and candidly, he said the worst thing the white man ever taught the black race was to hate themselves. So when you're learning hate for yourself in the educational system, then this must be looked to as a paradigm or an avenue to have continued hate in a formal setting. So the education, if it's not capable of changing the mindset and have you look to people who look just like you as heroes, we have to think about education and what it has forward the masses of us as our heroes, the founding fathers. And some of those founding fathers, we don't question their brilliance because we can look right now in American society and see the brilliance and their sacrifice. But the question is, how can education booster one very small group and, for the most part, marginalize the masses of people? How can we be dumbed down by the Pythagorean theory? It's another good question. Well, if you understand the idea of African education and the history of African education, then you would question the Pythagorean theory and where it started, and if it is indeed a theory that was started in the Western world. So I want to go to some of the things that Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers from Northeastern Illinois University Center for Inner City Studies talked about years ago. He talked about the idea of the reputation of African education. And he says this: one of the great ironies of history is the complete reversal of the fame of African education. He said for the last 5,000 years, 4,000 years, that it was an exemplary model for the rest of the world. African education was considered by the most educated persons to occupy what we call an exemplary status. And then we talk about the idea of how this has been reversed. Only the last 350 years has this been reversed. So if we go 350 years back, we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. So up until about 300 years ago, 300 to 400 years ago, African education was the example that was used across the world for educating the masses of people. Now, here in America, we used, and we continue to use, Plato's Republic as the outset, the skeleton, or the paradigm that is used in public education. And when Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers begins to speak about the history of African education, he says it just like this: let us first consider the traditional reputation of African education. Homer's high regard for the Ethiopians and Herodotus' admiration for the ancient black-skinned and curly-haired Egyptians are well known. Now we're bringing to you what is considered to be a sweeping paradigm shift. So for those of us who have gone to school and have been educated by the Western world's thought and civilization process, some of these things will never come up. Here we go again. Here's the idea of the study of blacks versus black studies. Plato's evaluation of ancient Egyptian culture provides a clear insight to how it was tied into Greece. In his penultimate work, and the penultimate means the second to last work, the Timaeus, Plato set Solon, one of the wisest of the Greek sages, at the feet of Egyptian professors. Well, it's well known that Plato himself spent 13 years at the feet of Egyptian professors where he was taught in antiquity and the history of antiquity. Plato himself was more concerned with the idea of political science and philosophy than he was with the idea of science and mathematics. Why is that? Well, as we look to Plato's Republic, we can understand that what can be manipulated easier, the idea of political science or the idea of philosophy versus math and what we know as science. Well, I want to be very specific when I stop and say, if Plato is spending time at the feet of Egyptian professors and he's studying political science, this is a view, a microcosm into how advanced this system was, because they already had a formal system of politics. If there's the study of political science, then there must be an educated system that ties into politics, statesmanship, and that regard for creating what we know as policy. So Plato himself thought that it was more important for him to be able to master philosophy and the idea of how politics run than saying the idea of how science and mathematics plays an important part in civilization. So when we understand that in his Republic work, Plato attributes the invention of writing and literacy and reading to the great god Yehudi, who was looked to by the Greek god Hermes, or let's just say it very candidly, who was at best a ripoff of what we know as Hermes. Hermes was indeed a wise man, but he was wise through the wisdom and the sagacity of Egyptian and the Egyptian professors. So Plato, in his very important work, The Laws, he throws subtlety to the wind and openly appraises the Egyptian systems and their ability to teach mathematics. And I'll read something from him. He says, the law in Egypt, the statement of the statesmanship of things worthy in the highest degree of a statesman and legislator. To effect this would be the task of a god or a godlike man. Equally compelling was the way he talked about the idea of how mathematics was taught when he says, one ought to declare then that our children should learn as much of these subjects as the innumerable crowd of children in Egypt learned with their letters. And he goes on to say, when I was told of our condition in regard to this matter, I was ashamed not only for myself, but for the entire Greek world. Now, Plato's weight holds a lot. His thoughts have reverberated, and we see them now in what is considered public education. And Plato himself, very wise man to have traveled to Africa, perhaps even more wise to take the best out of what he called in African education, because perhaps he didn't feel like the importance of mathematics and science and leave the rest, which was indeed perhaps a difficult situation for him to master. So we have to give him the idea of his ingenuous and his ability to be very much so forthright when wanting to study a couple subjects and master those, other than studying some subjects that perhaps were a bit too advanced for his wisdom and acumen. So Aristotle, his critical student, he sings the same praises and he echoes the same sentiments of appraisal when he talks about the three theoretical sciences, technology, political science, and the idea of writing. His high opinion goes on through Socrates, through Diodorus, through Plutarch. And when we look at so many different items, we begin to see that African education begins to dominate. It begins to forward that thought that we now have somehow seemed to erase and somehow seem to have, at the very best, lessened, because we don't learn a lot about Imhotep, the father of medicine. We don't find a lot of information when we go any further than what we know as the transatlantic slave trade. There's a very wise saying that says, the further you can look back, the further you can see ahead. So whose legacy is education? Whose legacy did the Western world's education spring? Where did it begin? How was it formed? And more specifically, where were these ideas drawn from? So the fame of African education was international. The ancient Jewish scribes, in constructing their history, wrote much about Egypt and Ethiopia. The very magnitude of Solomon's sagacity, one text proclaims, Solomon's wisdom excelled all the wisdom of Egypt. That you can find in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 30. Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. That's Acts 7, verse 1 through 22. So when we understand the importance of African education, we begin to see the head of American education being at best taken directly from, if not, and I say this very clearly, if not completely stolen from a group of folks who have now been placed in a reverse section of where they originated from, the original man. And if it is proper, we should look to the original man as the guide. Somehow, some system has reversed this, juxtaposed where we are right now. And when we go to Francis Bacon, the prophet of experimental science in the early 17th century, he talked about just how important not only did the Egyptians excel the Greeks in science, but also recognized the priority of science over politics in the hierarchy of human development. So now we're talking about a group of people who were very wise, who had a system of civilization. And there we go. That key word, civilization. When we talk about civilization, civilization are things that are learned. So when we talk about the idea of what the word Caucasian means and where it comes from, well, we know that the hills of Caucasus, 440,000 square kilometers between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. That's the idea of where the word comes from. So if we can just compare and contrast these two from what Sheikh Joseph Anta talked about in his two-cradle theory, he said we are just entirely different people from entirely different parts of the world. And the first thing he looked to was climate. He talked about the difference between those climates in Africa and those climates in that part of the world that we know to be the hills of Caucasus. Completely opposite, polar, diametrically opposed. So in turn, Isaac Newton, a very brilliant man, he says this: the Egyptians were early observers of the heavens and the earth. Philosophy was spread among other nations, and from them to the Greeks, a people more addicted to the study of philosophy than nature derived there first, as well as the soundest notions of philosophy. That's Isaac Newton, a very bright man. We can go on to the French Count Volney, when he says, after traveling through several lands, a people now forgotten, discovered while others were yet barbarians. I wonder who he was talking about. The elements of the arts and sciences, a race of men now rejected from society for their sable skin and their frizzled hair, founded those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe. If Count Volney, if Isaac Newton, if these men of great wisdom continue to sing the praises, well, my father, at 82 years old, very wise man, very formally educated man, very dedicated to the upliftment of those who have been found in the bowels of society, says, well, when everybody says something, there must be some truth to it. And he also said, everybody's not lying when you hear the same thing. So when we understand the implicity of African-centered education systems, we understand that they created more than 250 generations of educated men, women, and children who built pyramids, who developed mathematical formulae, who wrote medical and surgical journals. Now, how does a group of savages, those who have bones in their noses, swinging through trees, as we are so very depicted in so many times when we talk about Africa, how did this particular group create profound bodies of literacy, philosophical texts, and wisely governed most of the world, inside and outside of Africa, up until what we know now as the transatlantic slave trade. How does this compare and contrast to what is being taught in the American educational system? How does this bring about critical thought? And how can one, and I'll go back to this question, how can one be dumbed down by the Pythagorean theory? How can a young black child be dumbed down by the Pythagorean theory? Well, he'll never understand that that Pythagorean theory was a ripoff. It was taken from Africa and now has been forwarded, repackaged, and given to him as if it came from the Western world. That is indeed a dumbing down process. That is what you call the idea of a finite education, which leads one looking to his enemy for questions, answers, and salvation. Well, education, it does indeed civilize us. But as one who is an educator, the idea of education, well, formally educated. Anything after high school, you have an associate's degree, which is a 2-year college degree, which is indeed an accomplishment. And then you have a bachelor's of education or a bachelor's of arts, an AA, and then a BA, which is indeed now becoming very needed in any workplace to find yourself employment. And then you have a MA, which is a master's of arts. And then you have a PhD. And then let's go back and look at them, a AA, a BA, a MA, a Master of Arts. And the question is, in America, what have you mastered? What has been forwarded to you when you get a master's degree, and what have you mastered? And then a PhD, which some say when you talk about a PhD, that is the highest that one can attain as far as formal education. And when we say a PhD, they actually begin to call you doctor. So as one who comes from a system of oppression, I'm either a revolutionary or I'm an oppressor. Well, to be very clear, I've been taught to be a revolutionary, which means I'll bring new ideas, new attitudes, and new behaviors to the old problems, which will indeed allow me to heal. So if you call one a doctor, they must possess the proclivity to heal the social ills and where they come from. So you get an AA, a BA, a MA, a PhD, and sometimes it can all add up to BS. When we understand that it has been sculpted, it has been shaped, it has been forwarded for the idea of creating another generation that will indeed be lost by the idea of being absorbed by the whole society. And Dr. Bobby E. Wright said it. He called it menticide. When one looks to their open enemy to control the idea of what they will learn. Brother Malcolm said it well. And Brother Malcolm said, only a fool allows their enemy to educate their children. Ladies and gentlemen, this information may in no means change your life, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain with esteem and respect, a distinguished man of color, Frederick Douglass Dixon. Thank you.